The Llamas of Lane County. If you drive through Oregon's countryside in late summer, you'll notice something curious about the rhythm of the land. The air smells faintly of hay and rain, and the fields glisten in a way that feels both wild and carefully tended. And somewhere, just past a row of Douglas firs and a handmade sign that says, "Welcome to the county fairgrounds," you might hear a sound that doesn't quite belong. A long, high-pitched hum, something between a sigh and a song. That's a llama. Tall, calm and slightly judgmental, the llama is not native to Oregon. It's a creature of the Andes, bred for endurance and companionship, prized for its wool and its odd regal dignity. Yet somehow, through the winding currents of history, it found its way into the Pacific Northwest's patchwork of farms and fairs. And by the 1980s, there were enough llamas in Oregon to justify something that sounds almost like a punchline: a llama license. A law no one expected. To understand how such a law came to be, you have to picture Oregon not as the hip, modern state most people imagine today, but as a network of small, semi-rural communities where farming and festivals were central to identity. Fairs weren't just about fun, they were serious business. They were how farmers showed off their breeding stock, how kids won ribbons for projects, and how entire counties came together to celebrate the end of summer. And animals, cows, goats, sheep, alpacas, and yes, llamas, were at the center of it all. But with that came risk. Every fairground was a swirling exchange of fur, hooves, and microbes. Diseases could spread between herds faster than anyone could track. One sick animal could cause catastrophic loss for farmers across counties. By the late 1970s, Oregon's Department of Agriculture was struggling to prevent outbreaks of diseases like brucellosis, bovine tuberculosis, and Johne's disease, infections that could move silently through herds from llamas to cattle to humans. So they introduced a rule. Any camelid, including llamas, that entered a fairground or public event had to be properly licensed and certified as disease-free. On paper, it was dull bureaucracy. In reality, it was the birth of one of the strangest legal footnotes in modern Oregon history. The rise of the llama boom. The 1980s were an unusual decade in American agriculture. While many traditional farms were shrinking, a niche market for exotic livestock was exploding. Wealthy landowners, hobby farmers, and suburban enthusiasts began collecting animals like emus, ostriches, and llamas, partly for their novelty, partly for their perceived business potential. Llamas became a national craze. Newspapers ran light-hearted features with headlines like "The Gentle Giants of the Andes Find a Home in Oregon" and "Wool Worth Its Weight in Warmth." Celebrities bought them. High-end boutiques in Portland sold llama wool sweaters as symbols of rustic sophistication. And at every county fair, llamas drew crowds of curious onlookers who wanted to pet one, pose for a photo, or simply ask, "What even is that thing?" With so many llamas appearing in public spaces, the state had a problem. No one knew where they came from or what they might be carrying. Thus, in the pages of Oregon's agricultural code, a new line appeared. Small, unassuming, but oddly poetic in its specificity. All camelids entering public exhibitions or agricultural fairs must present valid licensing and health certification in accordance with state veterinary standards. Most people never noticed it, but for farmers, fair organizers, and a certain breed of eccentric llama enthusiasts, it changed everything. The paperwork parade. At first, people thought it was a joke. When the Lane County Fair Board received the first notice in 1983, one of the organizers reportedly laughed out loud and said, "What's next? Goat passports?" But soon the memos arrived in earnest. State veterinarians distributing official inspection forms, county clerks printing new permits, and livestock officers quietly preparing for an unexpected wave of paperwork. A local newspaper, the Eugene Register-Guard, ran a small headline that summer. Llamas now require licensing for fairgrounds. New health code surprises owners. The article quoted a bewildered farmer named Helen Moretti, who kept 2 llamas on her small homestead near Creswell. She told the reporter, "I just don't see how a creature that won't even eat meat could possibly be a danger to anyone." But when officials explained the reasoning, disease, control, traceability and biosecurity, she shrugged and said, "Well, I suppose if it means I can keep showing them, I'll get the paperwork done." And so she did. By the time the next year's fair rolled around, Oregon's agricultural bureaucracy had a new rhythm. Veterinarians travelling between farms, stamping forms with crisp blue ink, fair organisers keeping neat lists of animals, cross-checking numbers with state records, and llama owners proudly hanging laminated permits beside their animals' name cards. Some treated it as a badge of honour, others as a mild inconvenience. But everyone, in their own quiet way, became part of a peculiar historical moment. The brief, bureaucratic age of licensed llamas. Llamas in the law books. If you open the Oregon Department of Agriculture's livestock exhibition regulations from the mid-1980s, you'll find that the llama rule isn't presented as a novelty. It sits comfortably among references to cattle, sheep, goats and horses. But even on the page, the word llama feels different, exotic, almost comical in contrast to the utilitarian tone of the surrounding text. There were sections about mandatory veterinary checks, rules for housing, and the requirement for each exhibitor to provide a health certificate issued within 30 days of the event. Failure to comply could result in fines or disqualification. And, crucially, the same rules applied to alpacas and vicuñas, though very few Oregonians could tell the difference between them. Still, the law worked. disease incidents at fairs dropped, and the llama community, initially skeptical, began embracing the regulation as part of their identity. They even organized the Oregon Llama Association, a group that held educational workshops, fun competitions, and eventually a yearly license parade where owners proudly displayed their laminated certificates. It became a running joke among ranchers. You can't drive without a license, you can't fish without a license, and in Oregon you can't strut a llama without one either. Culture of care. But beyond the humour lay something surprisingly progressive. The licensing system wasn't just about control. It reflected a shift in how people thought about animal welfare and public responsibility. In the old frontier days, livestock laws were punitive. If your cow got loose, you were fined. If your pig caused trouble, you paid damages. The llama license, though, represented something more thoughtful, an early recognition that animal ownership came with stewardship. It said in quiet legal language that every living creature entering public life should be treated with care, documentation, and respect. Over time, that approach spread to other species, including dogs at adoption events, petting zoos, and even exotic reptiles at educational exhibits. Oregon's quirky little llama rule had set a precedent for how modern states would think about biosecurity through compassion, whispers and wanderers. By the mid-1990s, the llama boom had cooled. The animals were still around, but the market frenzy had faded. Fewer newcomers joined the hobby, and the fairs grew quieter. Yet the rules stayed, quietly tucked inside the state's livestock code, as much a part of Oregon's identity as its rain and evergreens. Occasionally, tourists would stumble across a newspaper clipping or hear a fair announcer joking about licensed llamas and laugh, assuming it was satire. But it wasn't. It was law, real, enforceable, and still in place long after the fad had passed. In 2003, a state agricultural report even listed camelid exhibition permitting among its ongoing inspection categories. There was no sign of repeal because no one needed to repeal it. The rule had become part of the scenery, like the fences, the hay bales, the gentle hum of livestock at dusk. Somewhere in the background, a child might tug at their parent's sleeve and whisper, "Do llamas really need licenses?" And the parent, glancing down at the laminated tag on the animal's pen, would smile and say, "In Oregon, yes, they do." The rebellion at the county fair. By the summer of 1986, the llama license rule had gone from obscure bureaucratic curiosity to something of a local oddity. Most farmers accepted it. Some laughed about it. A few even framed their permits like trophies in their barns, proof they were part of a club that only Oregon could have invented. But not everyone was amused. In a town outside Eugene, a place called Coburg, known for its antique fairs and its slow amber sunsets, lived a man named George Hanley. George was not the sort to follow rules for the sake of rules. He was a carpenter by trade, a former forest ranger, and one of those men who believed the government was always half a step away from telling you what kind of socks you could wear on Tuesdays. He also happened to own 3 llamas. George called them Patty, Hoss and Montana. He'd bought them in 1982 from a travelling livestock auction, partly as a joke and partly because he liked how calm they looked compared to his rowdy goats. Over the years, he grew fond of them, brushed them daily, fed them apples, even built a small wooden sign on his pasture fence that read, "Hanley's Llama Ranch. Spit happens." And when the Oregon Department of Agriculture sent out its notice requiring all fair-bound camelids to carry licenses, George did what you might expect him to do. He ignored it. The letter and the laugh. The letter from the Lane County Fair office arrived in April. Crisp white paper with a gold embossed seal and an overly polite tone. "Dear Mr. Hanley, in preparation for this year's livestock exhibition, please ensure that all animals, including llamas, are registered and carry the appropriate health certification as required by Oregon Agricultural Statute 18.7c. Failure to present valid licensing may result in disqualification. Sincerely, Fair Coordinator, Lane County Agricultural Board." George read it once, then twice, then laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "Licenses for llamas," he said to his wife Clara. "What's next? Driver's tests for goats?" Clara, who'd grown used to George's defiance of anything stamped with a seal, smiled faintly and said, "Don't start trouble this year, George. Just get the papers like everyone else." But George didn't. Instead, he hatched a plan. The great unlicensed entry. That July, under a sky painted with the pale gold of Oregon summer, George loaded up his llamas in a rusty horse trailer and drove them to the fairgrounds. At the gate, a young volunteer, clipboard in hand, nervous in the way that only teenage fair volunteers can be, asked for his paperwork. George handed her a folded piece of notebook paper. In thick black marker, it read, "License to spit freely, approved by common sense." The girl blinked. "Sir, this isn't—" "Sure it is," George interrupted. "It's signed, see? Right there." He pointed to his own name, written in a childish scrawl. George, the Llama Law Outlaw. The volunteer hesitated, then decided this was above her pay grade. She waved him through. And so, on the opening day of the 1986 Lane County Fair, 3 unlicensed llamas stood proudly under a blue canopy marked Hanley Ranch. Their wool shone like cream in the sun, their big eyes calm, their jaws chewing grass with an almost philosophical patience. Within hours, they became the talk of the fair. Rumours in the dust. Word spread fast. Someone whispered it to the kids near the sheep pens. Someone else mentioned it in the livestock office. By noon, half the fair knew there was a man flaunting the law with 3 rogue llamas. Reporters arrived from the Register Guard and the Corvallis Gazette Times. They snapped photos of George standing beside his animals, arms crossed, chin up, as if he'd just defended the Bill of Rights single-handedly. When asked why he refused to comply, he said simply, "Because llamas don't need permission to exist." The article ran the next morning under the headline, "Llama Outlaw Challenges Livestock Law. Farmer Refuses to License Animals." Most readers chuckled. A few officials did not. The hearing. 2 weeks later, George received a notice from the Department of Agriculture requesting his appearance at a compliance hearing. It was held in a nondescript beige office in Salem, where the air smelled faintly of coffee and bureaucracy. Across from George sat Dr. Marjorie Lindstrom, a state veterinarian who'd spent 2 decades trying to modernize Oregon's livestock standards. She adjusted her glasses, opened a folder, and said, "Mr. Hanley, our concern isn't your humor. It's public health." George leaned back in his chair. "You think my llamas are going to spread the plague?" Dr. Lindstrom sighed. "No, sir, but diseases like John's or caseous lymphadenitis can spread quietly. We require certification for all animals entering public events to protect everyone's herds, not to punish individuals." Her tone wasn't harsh, just tired. She'd had this conversation 100 times with stubborn ranchers. But George wasn't angry anymore. He could see she wasn't the villain he'd imagined. She was just a woman trying to keep order in a world full of dust, fur, and opinionated farmers. After a long silence, George said, "All right, suppose I get them licensed. Then what?" Dr. Lindstrom closed her folder and said softly, "Then you bring them next year, and no one calls you the llama outlaw again." The shift. Something changed in George after that. Maybe it was her calm explanation, or maybe it was the way she'd said everyone's herds. As if the llamas didn't just belong to him, but to a larger story of shared responsibility. He went home, filled out the paperwork, and got his llamas tested, tagged, and certified. The vet who did the inspections, a kind old man named Dr. Lowell, even joked that Patty, Hoss, and Montana were the healthiest animals he'd seen all summer. When George returned to the fair the next year, he came armed with a folder so thick with documents it could have doubled as a seat cushion. He handed his permits to the volunteer at the gate and said, "Tell the board I'm a law-abiding citizen now." The volunteer laughed, but the moment was genuine. In his quiet, mule-stubborn way, George had come full circle, from rebel to participant. A legend takes root. By the late 1980s, the llama outlaw story had become local legend. Kids told it around campfires at gatherings. Teachers used it as a lesson in civic responsibility. and the Lane County Fair even added a novelty contest one year. Best dressed llama with proper papers. George attended every year until his death in the late 90s, always setting up the same hand-painted sign. Spit happens. Only now, beside it, he hung his laminated license. In interviews, he sometimes joked, "Turns out the state and I both just wanted what's best for the animals. We just took different roads to get there." And perhaps that was the real heart of the story. How a silly-sounding law about llamas ended up bridging a gap between government and community, between red tape and real life. Legacy of the law. Years later, when Oregon updated its agricultural codes, the llama license section remained. Quietly modernized, rephrased, but still there. And every so often, someone new would stumble upon it and laugh, assuming it was satire. But those who remembered George's story knew better. They knew that behind every line of regulation was a human tale of pride, misunderstanding, and eventual respect. By the time Oregon's llamas appeared at the 2008 State Fair, sleek, well-groomed, their owners proudly flashing certificates, the law had stopped feeling absurd. It felt like part of Oregon's personality, a blend of pragmatism, humor, and an almost poetic sense of order in the wilderness. And in that sense, the llama law had done something extraordinary. It had transformed from a line in a handbook into a parable. Proof that even the strangest sounding rule can carry a story worth remembering. The law becomes legend. By the turn of the 1990s, the llama licensing rule had become part of the Oregon landscape. Just another quiet piece of bureaucracy that most people ignored until fair season rolled around. Yet, like many things in small-town life, it had begun to take on a second meaning, something beyond its paperwork and ink. It had become folklore. In farmhouses from Lynn County to Bend, you could hear the story told around dinner tables and at Grange meetings. The state once made us license our llamas. Real thing, no joke. And people would laugh, shake their heads and say, "Only in Oregon." But behind the laughter there was a sense of affection. The llama law wasn't just strange, it was ours. It said something about the state's personality, practical, slightly eccentric, and always a little more concerned about doing things properly than most places would admit. And like all good folklore, it began to take on a life of its own. A festival of wool and wit. It started with a simple idea in 1991. A fair organizer named Janine Carter, who worked for the Lane County Agricultural Board, decided to make something out of the llama craze that still quietly lingered across Oregon's fairs and markets. She'd grown up hearing the story of the llama outlaw, George Hanley, and thought the law itself could be turned into a kind of celebration. So she pitched a new event to her colleagues, the Licensed Llama Parade. At first, people laughed. Then they realized she was serious. Her plan was whimsical but brilliant. A light-hearted procession where licensed llamas, complete with decorated halters and official-looking tags, would walk through the fairgrounds to celebrate Oregon's most peculiar regulation. Owners could dress them up, display their paperwork like medals, and compete for ribbons in categories like Best Dressed, Most Legal, and Best Haircut. The idea caught fire. By August of that year, hundreds of spectators lined the fair's Central Avenue to watch a dozen llamas strut proudly past the livestock barns. Some wore hats, some wore bow ties. One particularly ambitious owner even dressed their llama as a police officer, complete with a cardboard badge that read, "Licensed to Spit." The crowd roared with laughter. And just like that, a new Oregon tradition was born, the llama as icon. Soon, the licensed llama parade became an annual fixture, not just in Lane County, but across the state. Bend, Salem, and even small towns like Lapine and Silverton began hosting their own versions, complete with mock inspection booths, where volunteers would stamp certificates and hand out stickers that said "officially approved." Local newspapers began running photo spreads every summer with headlines like "Llamas parade their papers in annual fair ritual." Oregon's quirkiest law keeps its charm. And beneath the humor, something deeper was happening. The law, once mocked for its absurdity, had become a cultural mirror. It reflected the things Oregonians valued: community, individuality, a touch of rebellion, and a good sense of humor about it all. One columnist wrote in the Oregonian, "In a world where rules often divide us, Oregon found a way to laugh with one." The llama license has become less about paperwork and more about pride, a reminder that laws are what we make of them. And she was right. At every fair, you could see that transformation happening in real time. Farmers and city folks mingling, kids learning about agriculture, and llamas, stoic as ever, standing calmly while the world around them grinned. The art of the law. As the years passed, artists began to take notice too. A painter from Eugene named Theo Barnett created a series of watercolor illustrations called The Licensed Beasts, portraits of llamas wearing bureaucratic badges against soft backdrops of Oregon forests and fairgrounds. The series toured small galleries across the state and even made its way to Portland, where critics praised it as whimsical Americana with an agricultural soul. Then came the poets. In a small anthology of Oregon, writing published in 1995, a poet named Marcia Lee included a piece titled Paperwork for Patty, inspired by George Hanley's famous Llama. The poem, gentle and wry, read like a lullaby about the tension between freedom and form. They said she needed papers to prove she'd done no wrong, so I led her to the vet that day and hummed a farmer's song. The world keeps making fences, the fields still look the same, a license in her halter now, but she still won't answer to her name. The poem went modestly viral in local literary circles, shared at coffee shops and university readings, recited at farm festivals. And before long, the licensed llama had become something like a symbol for Oregon's quirky relationship with rules. The idea that one could follow them, mock them, and find beauty in them all at once. The near repeal. But in the late 1990s, something unexpected happened. The Oregon Department of Agriculture announced plans to overhaul its livestock regulations. Buried deep in the proposal was a section suggesting the removal of outdated or redundant provisions, including, among others, the llama licensing clause. At first, no one noticed. Then someone did. A local journalist named Evelyn Park, who'd been covering agricultural fairs for years, spotted the line in a public draft of the new code and sounded the alarm in her Sunday column. Her headline was simple: "Don't take our llama law away." The article went semi-viral in the way things could in those days. People clipped it from the paper, posted it on bulletin boards, mailed it to friends. Evelyn's argument was equal parts serious and sentimental. She wrote, "This law may no longer serve a critical health purpose, but it serves a cultural one. It reminds us that rules are human things, sometimes clumsy, sometimes funny, sometimes wise. It would be a shame to erase something that makes us smile every summer." Her words struck a chord. Letters poured into the Department of Agriculture from across the state. Teachers, farmers, fair organizers, and even a few lawmakers. They weren't angry. They were affectionate. They said things like, "The llama law is part of who we are. It's silly, sure, but so is life sometimes. Please, let the llamas keep their licenses." And so, in a quiet act of bureaucratic mercy, the section stayed. The new code was passed, but the clause about camelids remained untouched. To this day, it's still there, dusty, unassuming, but intact. A teacher and a lesson. Years later, in the early 2000s, the story resurfaced in an unlikely place: a high school civics classroom in Corvallis. The teacher, Mr. Dennis Schultz, used the llama law as an example during a lesson about how government works. He'd stand at the chalkboard, smile at his students and say, "Who here thinks laws have to make sense?" A few hands would go up. Then he'd tell them about the llama license, how it started, what it meant, how it endured. By the end of the story, the students were always smiling. Then he'd say, "See, laws are made by people, and people are strange. But sometimes the strangest laws tell us the most about ourselves." One year, his class even invited a local farmer to bring an actual llama to school, complete with a replica license. The animal, calm and elegant, stood in the gymnasium under fluorescent lights while teenagers laughed and took photos. Someone hung a paper banner that read, "Citizenship in Action." For years afterward, students would remember that day, not because of the law itself, but because of what it revealed, that government could be funny, human, and oddly kind, the quiet wisdom of the rule. By the 2010s, the llama licensing story had faded from headlines, but remained deeply woven into Oregon's cultural DNA. You could find traces of it in county fair posters, in novelty T-shirts that said, "I'm a licensed llama." And in the easygoing pride, locals took in their state's quirks. Scholars of rural sociology began citing it in papers about community identity and humour. One wrote, "Oregon's llama license law demonstrates how regulation, when embraced by community narrative, can transform from constraint to cultural expression." And that, in many ways, was its legacy. It proved that laws could evolve, not just through amendments and repeals, but through meaning. That what begins as ink on paper can, through laughter and memory, become part of how a people see themselves. The fair at dusk. Picture it now, an Oregon fairground at dusk. The air is cool, the lights are just beginning to glow, and somewhere faintly the sound of children laughing mingles with the low hum of livestock settling into straw beds. A man in a wide-brimmed hat leads a llama past a row of barns. The animal moves slowly, its wool brushing against his arm. On its halter, a small laminated card catches the last of the sunlight. It says simply, "Licensed." He stops for a moment, pats the llama's neck, and smiles. Maybe he doesn't know the whole history behind that word, the debates, the rebellions, the festivals, the poems. But in that moment, it doesn't matter, because what was once a joke has become something gentler, something almost sacred, a symbol of care, connection, and continuity. Some laws protect us from danger, some remind us to laugh, and a few, like Oregon's llama license, quietly do both. The law in the age of Wi-Fi. By the time the 21st century settled comfortably into Oregon's valleys and highlands, the state had become a place where ancient evergreens and fibre-optic cables coexisted with surprising grace. Small towns that once thrived on sawmills and fairs now found their rhythm in farmers' markets, breweries, and Wi-Fi cafes. But even as the world changed, the llamas stayed. There were fewer of them now than during the wild breeding booms of the 1980s and early 1990s, but the herds that remained were beloved, well cared for, and strangely symbolic. To younger generations, they weren't just farm animals. They were part of Oregon's identity. And tucked away in that identity was still one small peculiar detail. You had to license your llama, a bureaucratic relic in a digital world. When the Oregon Department of Agriculture moved its licensing system online in the early 2010s, most citizens barely noticed. Farmers could now renew livestock permits with a few clicks, upload proof of vaccination, and even print digital copies for their own records. But among the drop-down menus and web forms was a curious option under camelids. It read simply, "Llama, llama glama, individual identification required." For most visitors to the site, it was an odd footnote. But for those who knew their local history, it was a quiet reminder of how long some ideas endure. An intern at the department, Emily Rowe, once wrote in a staff blog post, "Some people think it's a glitch, others think it's a joke, but it's neither. The llama license is one of the oldest continuously active pieces of livestock regulation in the state, and in its own way, it's beautiful." Her post went mildly viral. It got shared on Reddit and reblogged by several Oregon humor pages, complete with captions like, "Only in Oregon, even your llama needs paperwork." It was one of those small online moments that reminded people just how strange and endearing bureaucracy can be. The viral revival. In 2016, the story took on a new life. A Portland-based YouTube channel called Weird West Laws did a feature titled "The State That Licenses Its Llamas." The video opened with a soft-spoken narrator standing in a misty field near Eugene. Behind him, two llamas blinked curiously at the camera. He said, "Oregon is a place where people take rules seriously, even the silly ones, and that's what makes them work." Within days, the video had racked up hundreds of thousands of views. The comments filled with people joking about wanting to adopt a government-approved llama, or asking whether alpacas needed passports. But tucked between the jokes were real stories from farmers, families and long-time residents who shared what the law meant to them. "We still frame our license every year. It's part of the farm's soul. My dad told me about George Hanley and Patty the llama when I was 5. Now I'm 25, and I tell the same story to my kids." That video did something few expected. It reintroduced a whole generation to a forgotten piece of state history. And suddenly, Oregon's llama law wasn't just a relic. It was a legend reborn. Tourism and the Llama Trail. By 2018, small rural towns began noticing a trend. People were showing up, asking where they could see the licensed llamas. At first, local shop owners thought it was a joke. Then they realized it was an opportunity. In the summer of 2019, the town of Cottage Grove launched a tourism initiative called the Oregon Llama Trail. It wasn't an official state route, more of a loosely connected string of farms, bed and breakfasts, and rural art shops that featured llamas as mascots. Visitors could stop at each station along the trail, take photos with the animals, and get their trail passport stamped, a tongue-in-cheek nod to the real llama licensing certificates. At the end of the trail, in a small museum near the fairgrounds, tourists could even pose with a replica of George Hanley's original license from 1984, meticulously recreated from county archives. The whole thing started as a modest local project, but within a year, travel blogs and social media influencers had caught on. Photos of llamas wearing flower crowns under misty Oregon skies began appearing on Instagram with captions like, "Licensed to chill. Keeping it legal, keeping it llama." The hashtag licensed llama trail trended regionally for weeks, a state of gentle absurdity. At some point, even the governor's office got in on the fun. During Oregon's Agricultural Appreciation Week in 2021, the official state Twitter account posted a light-hearted photo of a llama draped in the Oregon flag with the caption, "Rest easy, citizens. This one's fully licensed." It went mildly viral, picked up by national media, and featured in a late-night talk show segment called Real Laws, Unreal Stories. When asked about it later, the governor smiled and said, "You know, we have bigger things to worry about, but it's nice that people care about this one. It says something about who we are, that we can follow the rules and still have a sense of humor." And that was the truth of it. The llama law had become more than a statute. It was a kind of folk mirror, reflecting Oregon's gentle absurdity, a balance between pragmatism and play, tradition and innovation, paperwork and poetry. The Digital Farm Diaries. In the early 2020s, a new generation of farmers began documenting their lives on TikTok and Instagram. Among them was Sophie Lynn, a 27-year-old agricultural science graduate who ran a small sustainable farm outside Albany. Her page, Llamas and Lettuce, featured her daily routines, feeding animals, tending hydroponic greens, and yes, renewing her llama license every spring. One viral clip showed her filling out the online form, her llama, Daisy, poking her nose into the frame. Sophie laughed and said, "You'd think after 40 years the state would trust Daisy by now." The video got over 1 million views. The comments were a blend of curiosity and delight. "Wait, this is real? How do I get my own llama licensed? This is the most Oregon thing I've ever seen." Sophie later did interviews about how she used the story of the llama license to teach kids about agricultural ethics. How laws protect animal welfare and help small farms stay accountable. Her approach was humorous, but it carried substance. "You can make fun of a law," she said, "and still understand why it matters." That sentence became something of a mantra among her followers. It summed up the Oregon attitude perfectly. Echoes in the classroom. Meanwhile, across the state, teachers and professors continued to use the llama law as a case study. Not in agriculture, but in civic identity. At Oregon State University, Professor David Henders, who taught environmental policy, began each semester with the same slide. A sepia photo of a llama standing in front of a courthouse, captioned simply, "Every law has a story." He told his students that laws aren't just rules. They're records of what a society once feared, once valued, or once found funny. Some laws protect, others instruct, and some endure because they make us smile. The llama license is all three. One year, his students even conducted a mock hearing, debating whether the law should be repealed, modernized, or preserved as heritage. The class split evenly. Half argued that it was outdated, half argued that it was a cultural treasure. When they voted, the keep it side won by 2 votes. Hender smiled and wrote on the board, "Democracy at work with llamas." A letter from the past. In 2023, something quietly remarkable happened. A retired clerk named Margaret Hanley, granddaughter of the original rebel farmer George Hanley, donated a box of her grandfather's old papers to the Oregon Historical Society. Inside were farm ledgers, photographs, and, tucked neatly among them, George's own handwritten letter protesting the first llama license requirement in 1983. It began angrily, but ended tenderly. "They say I must tag my llamas. Maybe they're right. Maybe rules keep us from forgetting what's good for everyone. But if a day comes when people can laugh at this rule and still follow it, then I suppose we'll have done something right." When the letter was displayed at the museum later that year, visitors paused in front of it for long moments. They read his words, looked at the old photograph beside it, George in overalls, his arm around Patty, and smiled. It was all there in his handwriting, the irritation, the pride, and the hint of hope that someday the rule would mean something more than red tape. And it had, the meaning of the license. So, what does the llama license mean today? Legally, it's a minor clause about disease prevention, livestock traceability, and health safety. Sensible, boring, and utterly unremarkable. But symbolically, it's become a shorthand for Oregon's way of being. Diligent but playful, grounded but a little ridiculous in the best way. When you see that small laminated card hanging from a llama's halter, you see decades of stories, rebellion, bureaucracy, laughter and care, all condensed into one absurdly charming object. It's proof that sometimes the smallest, strangest rules can become the biggest vessels of meaning. That communities can take something born of frustration and turn it into affection. And maybe that's what George Hanley understood at the end of his life, that laughter and order aren't opposites. They're partners in the human project of living together. The Night Parade. Every August now, in Lane County, the fairgrounds still glow under strings of yellow light as the annual licensed llama parade winds its way past the barns. Children run alongside the procession, waving paper certificates and laughing. The announcer's voice drifts over the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, these llamas are fully compliant and fabulously dressed." The crowd cheers. The animals walk with their serene, unhurried dignity. And somewhere in the back, an old man tips his hat, murmuring that it's good to see people still care about the silly things. Because sometimes the silly things are what keep us kind. the long shadow of the llama. When people look back on Oregon's history, they often think of timber, rain, microbreweries and mountains. Few, if any, would list llama licensing as one of the state's cultural pillars. And yet, like the steady hum of wind through the Cascades, it lingers, soft, enduring, quietly ridiculous, but undeniably part of the soundscape. The llama law never made headlines in the way great political acts do. It was never debated in fiery sessions at the Capitol, never turned into slogans, never used as a wedge between parties. Instead, it worked its influence in humbler ways, over fences, in barns, on dusty fairgrounds, and in conversations that began with laughter but ended with reflection. And maybe that's what makes it so rare. Because in a world of noise and conflict, Oregon's strangest law managed to bring people together by reminding them that even rules can have a sense of humor. The visitor from out of state. In the summer of 2024, a journalist named Hannah Whitmore drove up from California to do a story for American Life Quarterly on laws that refuse to die. Her editor had assigned her a list, strange relics scattered across the country. A Minnesota ordinance about tying giraffes to telephone poles, a lingering Kansas rule about ice cream on cherry pie, and of course, the Oregon llama license. Hannah didn't expect much from it. She imagined a 500-word sidebar, an amusing tidbit to fill space between serious stories about politics and policy. But when she arrived in Oregon, she found something different, something alive. Her first stop was Sweet Home, where she met a couple, Carol and Mike Torres, who'd been raising llamas for 20 years. Their barn was neat, their fields green, their animals alert and curious. When Hannah asked if they really needed licenses, Mike laughed. "Need is a funny word," he said. "It's not like they're pulling people over for unlicensed llamas. But yeah, we still do it. Tradition keeps the records clean, makes us feel connected to something." Carol added softly, "We frame them, everyone. They're part of our story now." Hannah followed them into their farmhouse, where indeed a row of framed certificates hung neatly on the hallway wall. Each was dated, signed and stamped with the state seal. A bureaucratic artifact turned into family heritage. It was the first time she realized that this law wasn't really about llamas at all. It was about belonging. The archivist. A few days later, Hannah visited the Oregon State Archives in Salem. There, among the rows of carefully catalogued documents, she met Dr. Samuel Patel, a historian of rural law who had written a small essay years earlier titled "From Fence Post to File Cabinet: The Agricultural Mind of Oregon." He pulled out a faded folder and spread it across the table. Inside were early drafts of the state's livestock codes, typed, corrected by hand, some stained with coffee. At the top of one page, dated 1983, a line read, "Camelids, Llama SPP, shall be considered livestock and subject to standard licensure and inspection. Dr. Patel smiled when Hannah read it aloud. Simple sentence, isn't it? But it's history in miniature. You see, every word here came from a meeting, a handshake, a disagreement, a decision. Laws are like sediment. They tell you what people were worried about at a particular time. He explained how disease control, record-keeping, and animal welfare were practical reasons for the law's creation, but how its survival owed everything to culture. The llama license isn't important because it's enforced. It's important because people remember it. They keep it alive. That's rare for a regulation. Hannah nodded. She could see now why the story had lasted so long. It wasn't because the law was funny, it was because it was human. The llama whisperer. In the high desert near Sisters, Oregon, Hannah met another kind of witness to the llama legacy. A young woman named Ruby Alvarez, who ran a small therapy program using llamas to help children with anxiety. Her farm, Solace Springs, sat at the edge of a pine forest where the light seemed to turn gold in the evenings. Ruby's llamas, gentle, long-lashed creatures named Luna, Juniper and Moss, moved slowly among the children, allowing themselves to be brushed and hugged. When Hannah asked Ruby about the license, she smiled knowingly. "Oh, I've got them. All legal." Then she added, "The kids love that part. They think it's hilarious that my llamas have government paperwork." Ruby laughed. "But it's also a teaching moment. We talk about how laws aren't just about control. They're about care. About saying this life matters enough to keep track of. It's funny, but it's beautiful too." Hannah wrote that down word for word. The moment of reflection. That night in her motel room, Hannah reread her notes. She'd expected irony, but she'd found sincerity. She'd expected to laugh, but she'd ended up feeling comforted. The llama law wasn't a joke anymore, not to the people who lived it. It had become a living parable about responsibility and humour, woven into Oregon's cultural DNA. She opened her laptop and began to type the first lines of her story. In Oregon, even the llamas have paperwork, and somehow that makes perfect sense. The meaning of the ridiculous. Across the state, others were reflecting on it too. At the Lane County Fair, fairgoers stopped at a booth run by the Llama Preservation Society, where they could sign mock licenses and take photos with life-size cutouts of famous llamas from Oregon's past. A small sign above the booth read, "The law that learned to laugh." People smiled, posed, and moved on. But behind that sign was a quiet truth, that absurdity can be a vessel for wisdom. When communities share laughter about their laws, it doesn't mean they disrespect them. It means they understand the spirit behind them, that cooperation doesn't have to be joyless, that structure and silliness can coexist. In that sense, Oregon's llama law had done something no piece of legislation could intentionally plan. It had made people kinder. The museum exhibit. In 2025, the Oregon Historical Museum in Portland opened a new permanent exhibit titled Curious Governance: The Laws That Shaped Us. Right beside the section on Prohibition-era liquor codes and environmental acts was a small, beautifully lit display labelled The Llama License, 1983 present. Inside the glass case sat 3 items: a framed certificate issued to George Hanley for his llama, Patty; a photograph from the first licensed llama parade showing a llama in sunglasses and a badge; a small plaque with an inscription that read, "Proof that law can be both functional and funny, and that community can transform regulation into ritual." Visitors often lingered at that case longer than any other. Children pointed and giggled. Older couples smiled and told each other, "I remember when that was in the paper." And everyone, for a moment, felt a gentle kind of pride. The kind that grows from knowing your home is just strange enough to be wonderful. A story told at sunset. Every evening, as the light fades across the Willamette Valley, farmers still walk out to their fields, feed their animals, and check the fences. Somewhere among them, there's always someone who stops, looks at their llama grazing in the last of the gold light, and chuckles softly. Maybe they remember getting the renewal notice in the mail. Maybe they remember the festival, the parade, the laughter. Maybe they think of old George Hanley and his stubborn protest, or of a poem they once read about a llama who didn't care much for paperwork. And in that moment, the world feels balanced again, equal parts earnest and absurd, rule-bound and free. That's the quiet beauty of the llama license. It never tries too hard. It just is. A law that became a story that became a smile. Why it endures. Scholars will tell you that traditions last because they serve a function, that they reinforce identity, maintain continuity, help societies remember what matters. But the llama law endures for a simpler reason. People like it. It makes them feel seen. It gives them permission to laugh at government without losing faith in it. It reminds them that bureaucracy too can have heart. And maybe that's the secret every society needs to remember. That when our rules become too heavy, we should find one small, gentle, ridiculous thing to balance them with. A thing like a llama license, the final parade. In August of 2026, the licensed llama parade celebrated its 35th anniversary. The fairgrounds were brighter than ever. Streamers in pastel colours, food stalls selling caramel corn and berry lemonade, and at the centre of it all, a long, slow procession of llamas walking proudly under the Oregon sky. At the head of the parade marched a young girl carrying a handmade banner that read, "This law made us laugh, and that's enough." As the llamas passed, the crowd cheered. Some waved old licenses laminated like family photos. Others simply stood and watched, their smiles soft, and knowing. And somewhere in the crowd, unnoticed, an elderly woman wiped a tear from her cheek. She was Margaret Hanley, the granddaughter of the man who'd once fought the rule. She whispered, "You were right, Grandpa." They did remember. The closing image. As twilight deepens, the fairground lights flicker on, casting a golden haze over everything. The llamas settle in their pens, their long necks silhouetted against the fading pink horizon. The laughter fades, the dust drifts, and the fair returns to quiet. Somewhere in a nearby barn, pinned to a wall, a small piece of laminated paper flutters in the breeze. The ink has faded a little, but the word across the top still shines clear. Licensed. And for a moment you can almost hear the echo of George Hanley's laugh, mingling with the hum of crickets and the distant sound of a Ferris wheel. Because laws come and go, and people forget most of them. But some, just a few, grow roots, stories, and smiles. And those are the ones worth keeping.